The early years of the 20th century were a strange time for the world at large, but especially for England, which experienced a series of events that changed the status quo and brought about an end to their status as a superpower. In that spirit, the celebrated English playwright Noel Coward combined the most difficult years of England's early 20th century existence into an epic. Cavalcade examined the ups and downs of two English families through the turbulent events taking place between New Year's Eve 1899 and New Year's Eve 1932. Through it all, we see the family grow and change through their experiences from the major red-letter points in their country's history: the Second Boer War, the death of Queen Victoria, the sinking of the Titanic, and the Great War. Perhaps because the audience at the time was so intimately familiar with these events, the play was a massive success. And then when it came to Hollywood, distributed by Fox and directed by Frank Lloyd, it was again an enormous hit. And then Oscar came calling, and it netted 4 nominations and won 3 for Best Picture, Best Director, and to William Darling for Best Art Direction. And yet, as time marched on and the populace of the generation who remember that specific time withered away, the film would largely be forgotten. Modern historians, myself included, who examine the film the year of 1933, find it odd that the Academy would choose a film so stiff and underwhelming in a year of such impressive diversity. This was the prime year for Mae West and the Marx Brothers, and for subject matter that would never pass muster once the production code got serious. Everything from bisexuality to polygamy, insanity, gluttony, lust, feminism, miscarriages of justice, and a heaping helping of animal lust, as this was the year of Marion C. Cooper and Ernest Schoedsack's King Kong, which was all but ignored at Oscar time but has become nothing less than movie folklore. And yet, in the year of the monkey, the Academy chose Grace and Civility, and one of the dullest, most forgettable films in its storied history. Hello and welcome to the Best Picture winners, a full-on survey of the films Oscar crowned the best of the year. My name's Jerry, and I'll be looking at each film from each year of the Academy's first century, and the people and events surrounding it. This time we're looking at Cavalcade, a stage-born examination of a family facing England's last days as a superpower. I never get tired of saying that movies are a window of times in which they are made. Whether we in the 21st century like it or not, each film represents those outlooks and attitudes that were important to a generation. Sometimes they stand the test of time, and sometimes they don't. That's maybe the fate of Cavalcade, a play written by Noel Coward in 1931, which probably had more significance to its immediate audience than it does to us here in the 21st century. His initial idea was to have a complete family history set during the French Revolution, but then he changed his mind when he saw a photograph of a steamer ship leaving port loaded with troops headed for the Boer War. The story has parallels with Upstairs, Downstairs, focusing on the idea that the wealthy upper class, the upstairs, and the servile lower class, the downstairs, experience much the same scrub of domestic drama and historical sweep. Both are prone to the same fortune and failure. The only difference between them are their financial circumstances. The upstairs are the Marriotts, headed by Father Robert, played by Clive Brooke, and the Mother Jane, played by Diana Wynyard, a grand lady of the stage making a rare screen appearance. The downstairs are their servants Alfred, played by Herbert Munden, and Ellen, played by the invaluable Una O'Connor. And the connecting point here is that both the upstairs and the downstairs do not devalue each other. There is a separation in their finances, but they care deeply about one another. This group somehow forms a family. Much of the movie focuses on how they deal domestically with the strife on the international scene that is making its way into their living room, especially since both the Second Boer War and the First World War send their men off to the battlefield. In those moments, we are left at home with the women, particularly Jane, who exhibits a 1,000-yard stare as she hopes and prays that her man will come home safe. He does, and the film is bookended by a tiny ritual that she and Robert share, that of toasting one another on New Year's Eve. That's important because out of all of the changes, out of all of the tragedies that they experience together, they reserve this one bit of continuity for themselves. As this ending scene happened, I so wanted to report that I was swept along, but I can't. As much as I tried to stay on the emotional track with Cavalcade, it is unbearably uninvolving, possibly because of the staginess of it, which renders the performances rather stiff and lifeless. Possibly because we never see the world events firsthand. Possibly because of the bad editing, which makes me feel like I'm sitting in the 5th row when I should be sitting at their dinner table. People die in this movie, and it's so circumstantial that it almost feels like parody. Take this scene, for example, as the Marriott's son Edward has gotten married and wants to take his new bride on a cruise for their honeymoon. Well, we already know what's going to happen because the movie splashed the date on the screen just moments before. And we're not surprised to note that they're obviously blocking something significant behind them. And they keep talking about the future, saying pointed things like, "I don't care if I die tonight." And the music switches not too casually to "Nearer my God to Thee." And if you've seen the other movie, then you know the significance of that. And then the reveal, gasp, no bugs, it's really not. The whole movie is like that. It's overdrawn and obvious and has a structure that's creaky at best. Much like Cimarron, it offers up a handful of characters and runs them through several decades of recent history. But, and I'm the guy who hated the earlier film, I think Cimarron did it much better. It wasn't a great film, or even really good film, but it did have a smooth transition through its time period. Here it feels like episodes, like I'm watching the second season of a Netflix show without having seen the characters build in the first. And it has a third act that rushes through its events with confusing mashed-together montages. First is the Great War, which is displayed in a way that's probably innovative at the time, but today looks just plain silly. And after you've seen All Quiet on the Western Front, you realize how it can be really effective. The second is meant to display the horror of the changing times, the post-war youth culture of the 1920s. Senior citizens Robert and Jane toast each other on New Year's Eve, and we are treated to scenes of slipping morality. Drinking, jazz music, homosexuality, whatever will the future bring. Actually, in spite of the filmmakers' objections, I think these things, freedom in our music, freedom to drink, and freedom in our sexuality, is pretty progressive. But I think the movie wants to suggest that these things are a devil's playground of immorality. Oddly enough, that seemed the template of the better movies of 1933. This was a year of progressive stuff in American film. In the lead up to the eventual takeover of the production code, this was a year of such wide-ranging films as Queen Christina, featuring a bisexual monarch, The Invisible Man, featuring Claude Rains' transparent sociopath, Babyface, featuring Barbara Stanwyck literally sleeping her way to the top, The Private Life of Henry VIII, featuring a joyfully gluttonous monarch both at the table and in the bedroom, Duck Soup, featuring the Marx Brothers' famous attack on war and the people who waged them, and two Meg West comedies, I'm No Angel and She Done Him Wrong, which were butchered by the Hays Code. Given that kind of progressive push, it is distressing that Oscar's favorite film of the year was so unimpressive, so distressingly stale out of a category that was largely very impressive. There was 42nd Street, based on the Broadway musical, Frank Borzegi's adaptation of Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, starring Paul Muni, Frank Capra's Lady for a Day, based on a short story by Damon Runyon, George Cukor's version of Little Women, starring Katharine Hepburn, which I recommend over her performance in Morning Glory, which got her first Oscar. Also, The Private Life of Henry VIII, featuring a legendary performance by Charles Laughton, which won him the year's Best Actor prize, She Done Him Wrong, based on a controversial play by Mae West, Smilin' Through, a romantic drama starring Norma Shear and Friedrich March, and State Fair, which is kind of an American version of Cavalcade, only better made and a lot more fun. But my favorite film of the year was the unnominated Designed for Living, directed by Ernst Lubitsch from a screenplay by Ben Hecht that was adapted from the hit play by Noel Coward, who also wrote Cavalcade. Those three names alone are a magical combination. Designed for Living tells the story of Gilda, a young artist played by Miriam Hopkins, who falls in love with two best friends, Tom, played by Friedrich March, and George, played by Gary Cooper, and can't decide which one she wants to be with, so she decides to keep them both with one simple rule.
No sex.
Although we know that won't stick. Designed for Living is very much about upending the expected role of a woman at that time. The role was expected to be, up to a certain age, looking for a stable boyfriend, then marrying him, and then spending your life waiting on him hand and foot, taking care of his meals, his clothes, and his children. Gilda has no use for any of these things. She's a free spirit, an artist who would rather run through a series of men until she's found one that she likes and that understands her. The story has three main leads, the men played by Gary Cooper and Friedrich March, but Gilda is really the main focus. She's an individual seeking her own path to happiness and cutting a swath away from the pomposity of the socially proper route that she is expected to take. And it is really a good thing that this movie landed in 1933. By this time in Hollywood, the production code was in place, but not quite enforced as it would be a year later. If Designed for Living had been delayed, it might not have been made at all. And because that production code went full force in 1934, the movie never got a re-release. The tricky subject matter was too baked into the story for the censors to cut around, and that's largely because Ben Hecht, one of the greatest screenwriters who ever lived, was very tricky in his language. Unlike Mae West, who was open and upfront in her sexual language, Hecht's dialogue danced cleverly around double entendres and taboo subject matter, so that you had to think it over in order to read what was between the lines. The movie is about a polygamous relationship, but there isn't a suggestion of a devil's triangle. It's the story of a woman who has sex with lots of different men, but you have to listen very carefully to get that. It ends with the suggestion that they will live together and that she will love both of them, but that no sex will be available. But we in the audience understand that human nature doesn't work that way. The movie never says it, but we get it. It performs on one level and speaks on another. The sex angle is there, but you have to be in tune with the movie to grasp it. It respects your intelligence that way. I love movies like that. I love movies in which the screenwriter realizes that the people on the screen can be just as smart as the people in the audience. I think that's the essence here. I think Design for Living trades on the modern and very progressive ideas about love and relationships and individuality, while I think Cavalcade seeks the safer waters of nostalgia and the traditional views of what makes a family. Historically, both films have largely been forgotten. Design for Living never got a re-release because its subject matter didn't fit the production code. It's better known now than it was in the previous decades, so much so that it got a Criterion release in 2011, but it's still not as widely known as it should be. Cavalcade, meanwhile, is even less known. It's had video releases, and it shows up on TCM during that month-long 31 days of Oscar block that they do every spring at Oscar time. But its only distinction, really, is being a Best Picture winner and being the last Best Picture winner that was seasonal. From this point on, all the Oscar winners will be annual. But personally, I don't see a possible rediscovery. The movie is too stiff, too dusty, too mannered, too stagey, too mawkish. I think its time is long past. For Armchair Cinema, I'm Jerry Dean Roberts. Thank you for joining us.